have no idea who I am, but tonight, the truth will speak.
The clinking of silverware formed a symphony of wealth, a soundscape Dominic Davenport thoroughly enjoyed. From his corner booth at Aria, one of New York City's most exclusive restaurants, he felt like a king. Across from him, his sycophantic junior partner, Pierce, hung onto his every word. They were finalizing a deal that would catapult them to the pinnacle of their industry, transforming them into titans of finance. Their waitress, a quiet woman with weary eyes, approached their table. To her, they were just another order, another transaction in a long, demanding evening. To Dominic, she was insignificant, a mere prop in his grand, self-aggrandizing performance. He leaned in, subtly shifting to his native German, and began to speak with unwavering confidence. His cruel words were a secret language, a private joke shared only between him and his accomplice. Little did he know that some secrets refuse to stay buried, and some seemingly insignificant props can bring the entire stage crashing down. The ache in Lena's feet was a dull, persistent throb, a rhythm she'd become intimately familiar with over the past 19 months. It stood in stark contrast to the staccato click of the expensive heels she once wore on the polished marble floors of the Deutsche Strategic Bank in Berlin. Now, her world was the plush crimson carpet of Aria, a Michelin-starred restaurant in the heart of Manhattan, where her sensible black shoes absorbed spilled wine and the silent, judging gazes of the city's elite. Each night was a performance. She wasn't simply Lena, the 32-year-old woman whose life had been systematically dismantled. She was the waitress, an efficient, smiling automaton. She'd mastered the art of being present yet invisible, anticipating needs before they were voiced, carrying plates laden with seared scallops and truffle foam as if they were the most precious artifacts in the world. To her patrons, they were. To her, they were simply heavy. Tonight, the air in Aria was particularly thick with the scent of money and ambition. A wave of Wall Street power players had descended, celebrating victories Lena could no longer comprehend. Victories built on foundations she understood intimately, but could no longer participate in. She moved among them, a ghost in a black uniform, refilling water glasses, clearing plates, and offering a practiced, gentle smile that never quite reached her tired gray eyes. Her manager, Maria, a stout woman with a no-nonsense demeanor and a surprisingly kind heart, gave her a sympathetic glance from across the room. "You got table 7, Lena," Maria whispered earlier, a hint of warning in her tone. "The big man himself?" "Davenport," she added, the name carrying a weight of unspoken caution. Try to stay off his radar. Lena knew the name. Who in New York didn't? Dominic Davenport was the founder and CEO of Davenport Capital, a private equity firm notorious for its ruthless, almost surgical takeovers. His face was a familiar sight in financial magazines, always accompanied by the same predatory smile and eyes that seemed to calculate the value of everything they rested upon. He was a shark, and Aria was one of his favorite hunting grounds. When she approached table 7, the energy was palpable, a tangible hum of power and expectation. Dominic Davenport was precisely as he appeared in print, impeccably dressed in a custom suit that likely cost more than her apartment's security deposit, with silver-streaked hair swept back from his forehead. He exuded an aura of absolute, unshakable self-importance. With him were 2 other men. One was young, with a desperate-to-please expression etched onto his face. Pierce, his junior partner. The other was an older, impeccably dressed Japanese gentleman, Mr. Kobayashi, whose calm, observant demeanor suggested he was the prize they were vying for. "A bottle of the Chateau Margaux," Dominic announced without looking at her, his voice a low baritone that demanded immediate obedience. He didn't bother with the name of the wine. He invoked its legend, a subtle test of the staff's knowledge. "An excellent choice, sir," Lena replied, her voice even and professional. She offered no commentary, no anecdote about the vineyard. She simply acknowledged the order and retreated. This was the key to survival. Be efficient, be respectful, and be forgettable. She returned with the wine, performing the familiar ritual of presentation and pouring with practiced grace. Dominic remained entirely engrossed in conversation with Mr. Kobayashi about market volatility. Pierce, however, watched her every move, seemingly ensuring she didn't spill a single drop of the liquid gold onto the pristine white tablecloth. "The key to our strategy, Kobayashi," Dominic was saying, his English laced with the arrogance of a man who had never encountered resistance, "is identifying undervalued assets with bloated, inefficient management. We don't just invest, we cleanse. We strip away the sentimentality and expose the raw, profitable core." Mr. Kobayashi nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "A philosophy of disruption, Davenport, my son," he observed. "Precisely," Dominic declared, taking a sip of the wine. He swirled it, inhaled its bouquet, and gave a curt nod of approval, not to Lena, but to the wine itself, as if it had presented itself for his judgment. Lena finished the pour and was about to step away when Pierce cleared his throat. "And a round of sparkling water, San Pellegrino," he requested. She nodded and turned. As she walked toward the service station, a faint, nagging sense of familiarity pricked at the back of her mind. It wasn't simply Dominic's public persona. It was something about the rhythm of his speech, the specific cadence of his arrogance. It reminded her of the men who had destroyed her career, the ones who had sat in boardrooms in Berlin, speaking in confident, clipped tones about cleansing and efficiency before carving up companies and lives, leaving ruin in their wake. She resolutely dismissed the feeling. It was a ghost, nothing more. Every powerful man sounded the same, didn't they? Her past was securely locked away, and she had no intention of reopening that Pandora's box. Her only concern was making it through the next 3 hours, collecting her tips, and returning to her tiny, anonymous apartment in Queens. The meal progressed as a carefully choreographed ballet of service and consumption. Lena moved with quiet efficiency, clearing the appetizer plates of tuna tataki and replacing them with the main courses. A perfectly seared filet mignon for Dominic, pan-seared halibut for Pierce, and a delicate miso-glazed black cod for Mr. Kobayashi. Throughout, Dominic held court, his voice the dominant instrument in the table's small orchestra. He was clearly trying to impress Mr. Kobayashi. The deal they were discussing was significant, a potential joint venture to acquire a German manufacturing company. As they ate, perhaps feeling the need to establish a more intimate, exclusive rapport, or simply to show off, Dominic switched to German. He likely assumed it was a safe channel, a private code in the bustling, English-speaking metropolis of New York. A waitress in a place like this, he reasoned, might be a struggling actress from Ohio or a student from California. The probability of her understanding the nuanced, business-centric German of a Frankfurt boardroom was, in his mind, 0. He leaned forward, a conspiratorial glint in his eye. "Also, Mr. Kobayashi," he began, his tone shifting, becoming sharper and more direct. "The board of Nordstern AG is weak. a bunch of old men clinging to the past. Lena was polishing cutlery near the service station, a few feet away. The language hit her not like a whisper, but like a physical blow. It was the German of her former life. High German, spoken with a slight Hessian accent, the dialect of the Frankfurt financial district. Her hands froze for a fraction of a second over a silver fork before she forced them to continue their methodical polishing. "Don't react. You're invisible," she silently commanded herself. "Absolutely," Pierce chimed in, his own German less polished, more eager. "We have internal projections that show we can cut their operating costs by 40%. Project Chimera will be a masterpiece. Nordstern AG." Project Chimera. The names echoed in the silent, ruined chambers of Lena's memory. Nordstern AG was a mid-sized, family-owned engineering firm from Stuttgart, known for its quality and its deep commitment to its employees. 3 years ago, back in Berlin, she had been the lead analyst on a defensive strategy for them, helping them fight off a hostile takeover attempt. The aggressor was a shadowy shell corporation, its true backers hidden. The plan she had drafted would have saved them, but then, the data she had based her entire strategy on was leaked. Not just leaked, but subtly altered, making her look incompetent, even criminally negligent. The deal collapsed. Her reputation was shattered, and the firm she worked for, eager to distance themselves from the scandal, threw her to the wolves. And the code name for that hostile takeover plan, the one she only discovered after it was too late, was Project Chimera. Her heart began to hammer against her ribs. It couldn't be a coincidence. The world was vast, but the world of high-stakes international finance was a small, incestuous village. She felt a cold dread mingle with white-hot rage. These men weren't just arrogant patrons. They were vultures picking at a carcass she had tried to save. They were inextricably linked to the moment her life had broken in two. She had to stay calm. She needed to hear more. She moved from the service station, her steps measured, and approached their table under the pretense of refilling their water glasses. She kept her eyes downcast, focusing on the flow of water into the crystal, her face a neutral mask. Dominic, now fully warmed up, gestured dismissively with his fork toward the general direction of the restaurant staff. "Man must loiter," he said, a smirk playing on his lips. "No, dear. You just have to ignore these people. They're just part of the decoration." He then looked directly at Lena, though his eyes seemed to pass right through her. He lowered his voice slightly, speaking to Pierce. "Look at her. Probably a failed artist or something. A pretty empty face, good enough to serve the rabble, but not a single thought behind it." Pierce chuckled nervously. "Alice. She does what she's told. That's all that matters." The insult was so casual, so profoundly dehumanizing, it almost stole her breath. It wasn't the worst thing she had ever heard. But coming from this man, in this context, layered on top of the revelation about Nordstern AG, it was like a match thrown onto gasoline. The weary ache in her feet was gone, replaced by a surge of adrenaline. The ghost of Berlin was no longer a faint memory. It was sitting at table 7, eating filet mignon and mocking her in the language of her birth. Mr. Kobayashi had remained silent during this exchange. He took a slow, deliberate sip of his water, and for a fleeting moment, his eyes met Lena's. There was no pity in his gaze, but there was a flicker of something else. Curiosity, perhaps? Even discomfort. He was a witness. Dominic, oblivious, continued. "The point is, we have to act fast. As soon as we have control, we will outsource the research and development department. They're valued so much. Too expensive? Too sentimental? Their most valuable patents are all we want. It was the exact strategy the Shell Corporation had planned 3 years ago. The exact strategy she had warned Nordstern against. Davenport wasn't just connected to her downfall. He was its architect. He had hidden behind layers of corporate secrecy, and now, years later, thousands of miles away, he was laying his sins bare on her table, assuming she was too stupid to understand. Lena finished pouring the water, her hand miraculously steady. She placed the pitcher back on her tray, her mind a whirlwind. The humiliation, the years of struggle, the injustice of it all coalesced into a single, sharp point of clarity. She wasn't just a waitress. She was Lena Vogt, and she remembered everything. The rest of the main course was a blur for Lena. She moved on autopilot, her mind a whirlwind of German phrases, corporate logos, and the ghost of her former self. The rage that had flared within her was now banked, simmering beneath a layer of icy calm. An opportunity had just fallen into her lap. A dangerous, terrifying, and utterly irresistible opportunity. She wasn't thinking about revenge. Not yet. She was thinking about justice. She served them dessert, a decadent chocolate lava cake for Dominic and Pierce, a light yuzu sorbet for Mr. Kobayashi. All the while, the German conversation continued, filled with financial jargon and self-congratulatory laughter. Dominic was boasting now, talking about a previous acquisition, a tech firm in Munich, and how they had trimmed the fat. A euphemism she knew meant laying off hundreds of employees right before the holidays. Finally, the meal was over. The plates were cleared. The last of the wine was gone. Dominic Davenport leaned back in his chair, patting his stomach with the satisfaction of a Roman emperor. He caught Lena's eye and snapped his fingers, a gesture of pure, unadulterated entitlement. "The check," he commanded in English. Then, as she turned to retrieve it, he made his final dismissive remark in German, a parting shot for the benefit of his companions. "Hurry up, girl. We have more important things to do than wait for you to drag your little shoes over here." Lena stopped. Her back was to them. The entire restaurant seemed to fade away. The clatter of dishes, the murmur of conversation, the distant city sirens. It all dissolved into a low hum. There was only table 7 and the echo of his words. "Hurry up, girl." She took a slow, deliberate breath. She could walk away. She could bring him the check, accept his likely paltry tip, and disappear back into her anonymous life. It was the safe choice. It was the smart choice. But 19 months of biting her tongue, of swallowing her pride, of accepting her unjust fate, it was all over. She turned around. She walked back to the table, not with the hurried shuffle of a servant, but with the steady, confident gait she used to employ walking into a boardroom. She held no bill folder. Her hands were empty, clasped loosely in front of her. She looked directly at Dominic Davenport, holding his gaze until he was forced to acknowledge her presence as more than a piece of furniture. A flicker of annoyance crossed his face. Lena smiled, but it was not her waitress smile. This one was sharp, precise, and utterly devoid of warmth. And then she spoke. Her voice was quiet, yet it cut through the air with stunning clarity. Her German was flawless, not the casual German Dominic had been using, but the formal, academic high German of a university-educated professional. And she began, her tone perfectly level. "Excuse me, sir. Your bill will be right out, but I must point something out to you." The effect was instantaneous and seismic. Dominic Davenport's smug expression didn't just fall, it shattered. His jaw went slack. His eyes widened in disbelief. He looked as if a statue had just started speaking to him. Pierce froze with a piece of chocolate on his fork, his face paling to a sickly white. He looked from Lena to Dominic and back again, pure panic in his eyes. The only person who didn't look utterly shocked was Mr. Kobayashi. He simply placed his napkin on the table, leaned forward slightly, and watched Lena with an expression of intense, undivided interest. Lena continued, her gaze locked on Dominic. As a matter of simple, unmitigated disrespect, your grammar is a bit sloppy when addressing a lady, even if she is just a waitress. Young woman or miss would perhaps be more appropriate than girl. It lacks respect. She let the correction hang in the air, a small, precise incision. It was more than a comment on his language. It was a challenge to his perceived superiority. Dominic finally found his voice, sputtering in a clumsy mix of German and English. Was verrückt. What do you think you're doing? Lena's smile tightened. She said, echoing Pierce's earlier sycophantic remark, I'm just doing what I'm told. That's all that matters, right? But sometimes one overhears things. For example, that the board of Nordstern is weak, or that Project Chimera aims to dismantle their research and development department to get to their patents. Every word was a hammer blow. Pierce dropped his fork. It landed on his plate with a loud clatter that seemed to echo through the now silent space around their table. Dominic's face, already pale, was now ashen. The blood had drained from it completely. He was looking at her now, truly seeing her for the first time, and a horrifying dawning of recognition mixed with raw fear was blooming in his eyes. He didn't know who she was yet, but he knew she was not a waitress. She was a threat. The bubble of silence around table 7 was thick with tension. Dominic Davenport stared at Lena, his mind clearly racing, trying to place her, to categorize her, to understand the monumental miscalculation he had just made. He was a man who controlled every variable. Yet a random variable had just stood up and recited the core tenets of his most secret predatory plan. He tried to regain control, falling back on blustering authority. Das ist absurd, he snarled in German, his voice a low growl. That's absurd. You have no idea what you're talking about. You've been eavesdropping on private conversations. That's grounds for immediate dismissal. Lena didn't flinch. The fear she had lived with for nearly 2 years was being burned away by the righteous fire of the moment. Davenport, she replied, her voice still dangerously calm. Briefly, Davenport Capital. Oh, I believe I know exactly what I'm talking about, Mr. Davenport. Project Chimera isn't a new plan. It's an old plan repackaged from 3 years ago. Back then it was pushed by a shell company called Ethelred Holdings to disguise the true investors. Investors like, for example, Davenport Capital. At the mention of Ethelred Holdings, Pierce made a small, choking sound. It was an old entity, buried deep in their corporate history, a tool used for their most aggressive and legally ambiguous operations. For a waitress to know that name was simply impossible. Dominic's eyes narrowed. The bluster was gone, replaced by a cold reptilian focus. Who are you? He demanded, switching back to English, as if the language itself could offer him a shield. This was the moment, the culmination of everything. Lena stood a little taller, and for the first time that night, she let the mask of the weary waitress fall away completely. In its place was the face of the sharp, brilliant financial analyst she had once been. My name, she said, speaking slowly and deliberately, her German crisp and clear for all 3 men to understand, is Lena Vogt. She let her name hang in the air, To Pierce and Mr. Kobayashi, it meant nothing. But she wasn't looking at them. She was looking at Dominic Davenport. She saw the flicker of confusion in his eyes, then the frantic search through his mental archives of enemies and obstacles. And then she saw the moment he found it. The moment the puzzle pieces clicked into place. His face went from ashen to the color of bleached bone. It was a look of pure, unadulterated horror. He remembered her. Lena Vogt, the lead analyst from the Deutsche Strategic Bank in Berlin. Lena continued, pressing her advantage, her voice resonating with the weight of her history. My name is Lena Vogt. I was the lead analyst at Deutsche Strategic Bank in Berlin. I was the one who wrote the defensive strategy for Nordstern AG against your first attack. The strategy that would have worked if my data hadn't been stolen and manipulated to discredit me and destroy my career. You didn't just get me fired. You erased me. And you thought I had disappeared forever. She took a step closer to the table, leaning in slightly, her voice dropping to an intense whisper. You hid behind your lawyers and shell companies, but I always suspected your involvement. I just never had the proof until tonight. You just served it to me on a silver platter, along with your insults. Dominic Davenport, the titan of industry, the king of Aria, was speechless. He looked like he had seen a ghost, and in a way, he had. The ghost of a life he had ruined had just served him his dessert. He had mocked a waitress, and in doing so, had confessed his corporate sins to the one person on earth who understood their full significance. Pierce looked like he was about to be physically ill. He was a junior partner. He was implicated, but he wasn't the architect. He was just a passenger on a ship that was now suddenly taking on water at an alarming rate. Then, a new voice entered the conversation. Mr. Kobayashi, who had been watching the entire exchange with the quiet intensity of a chess master, folded his hands on the table. He looked at Lena, and for the first time, he spoke to her directly, his English formal and precise. Miss Vogt, he said, his voice calm but carrying immense authority. Your name is familiar to me as well. My own company, Kobayashi Heavy Industries, was approached by Ethelred Holdings 2 years ago with a similar, disruptive proposal for one of our competitors. We declined. We found their methods to be dishonorable. He turned his cool gaze upon Dominic. Mr. Davenport, I believe our dinner is concluded, and so is our potential partnership. We will not be moving forward with Project Chimera or any other venture with your firm. With that, he stood up, gave a slight, respectful bow to Lena, not to Dominic, and walked away from the table without a backward glance, leaving stunned silence and the wreckage of Dominic Davenport's evening, his deal, and quite possibly his career. The departure of Mr. Kobayashi was like a gavel striking, ending the proceedings. The spell was broken. Dominic Davenport, who had been frozen in a state of horrified paralysis, finally lurched into motion. His face was a thunderous mask of fury and humiliation. You, he hissed at Lena, his voice trembling with rage. You're finished. I'll have you blacklisted from every restaurant, every coffee shop in this city. You'll be scrubbing floors for the rest of your pathetic life. Do you hear me? His voice was rising, attracting the attention of nearby tables. Patrons were starting to turn and stare, sensing the drama unfolding. Maria, the manager, who had been watching from a distance with a worried frown, began to stride purposefully toward them. Lena stood her ground. The threats that would have terrified her yesterday now seemed hollow. You already did your worst to me, Mr. Davenport, she said, her voice steady. You took my career, my reputation, my home. You think threatening my waitressing job scares me now? You just confessed to corporate espionage and market manipulation in front of a witness. I think you have bigger problems." Just then Maria arrived at the table. "Is there a problem here, Mr. Davenport?" she asked, her tone firm but professional. This employee of yours?" Dominic sputtered, pointing a shaking finger at Lena. "She's insane. She's been harassing us, making wild accusations. I want her fired now." Maria looked from Dominic's apoplectic face to Lena's unnervingly calm one. She had worked in this business for 30 years. She knew the difference between a hysterical employee and a cornered millionaire. "Lena," she said gently, "why don't you go take your break? I'll handle this." "She's not taking a break! She's fired!" Dominic roared. "Actually," Lena said, unpinning the small magnetic name tag from her uniform, placing it gently on the table, "I'm resigning. I quit." She offered Maria a small apologetic smile. "I'm sorry, Maria, for the scene." Maria simply shook her head slightly, a flicker of understanding, perhaps even a hint of pride, in her eyes. "Go on, honey." "It's all right." As Lena turned to leave, a hand gently rested on her arm. She turned to see Mr. Kobayashi. He had been waiting near the restaurant's exit. He extended a sleek black business card. "Ms. Volk," he said, his voice low and measured. "What Mr. Pete Davenport did to you was unjust. His planned actions against Nordst represent a malignant disease within our industry. My flight back to Tokyo isn't until Friday. I'd be very interested in hearing the full story. We may share common interests." Lena lowered her gaze to the card. "Kenji Kobayashi, CEO, Kobayashi Heavy Industries." It felt impossibly heavy in her hand. A lifeline unexpectedly thrown from the most unforeseen of sources. "Thank you, Mr. Kobayashi," she replied, her voice thick with emotion. I will call you." He bowed respectfully and departed. Lena walked through the restaurant's kitchen, past the stunned faces of her former colleagues. She bypassed her locker, exiting directly through the back service door and into the cool night air of the alley. Leaning against the rough brick wall, the adrenaline began to subside, leaving her trembling. She had done it. She had confronted the man who had destroyed her life, spectacularly dismantling her quiet, miserable existence. She was unemployed and without a plan. But for the first time in a long time, she felt free. The specter of Berlin no longer haunted her. She had given it a voice. Inside, Arya Dominic Davenport simmered in the wreckage. His deal was dead. His reputation with a major international player was shattered. And a ghost from his past now had a name, a face, and a powerful potential ally. As he tossed his credit card onto the table to pay the exorbitant bill, his thoughts weren't on the money. He focused solely on silencing Lena Volk permanently. The first domino had fallen, landing squarely on him. The war had just begun. The 24 hours following Lena's departure from Arya's were a surreal mixture of terror and exhilaration. The initial rush of righteous victory yielded to the harsh reality of her situation. Jobless, with dwindling savings, and a formidable enemy who knew precisely where to find her. Each buzz of her phone sent her heart leaping into her throat, anticipating a threatening message or a call from Davenport Capital's legal team. She spent the first night sleepless in her small apartment, Kenji Kobayashi's business card resting on her nightstand like a talisman. Could she trust him? His gesture appeared genuine, yet in her world, altruism was a rare and often deceptive commodity. He was a corporate titan, just like Davenport. Sharks rarely defended fish. They competed for the right to consume them. By morning, resolve had solidified her fear. She had nothing left to lose and everything to gain. Taking a deep breath, she dialed the number on the card. A crisp, professional voice answered promptly. Upon stating her name, she was immediately connected to Mr. Kobayashi. Ms. Volk. His voice was as calm and measured as it had been in the restaurant. I'm glad you called. I've taken the liberty of reserving a conference room at my hotel. Could you meet me in 1 hour? An hour later, Lena found herself not in a sterile conference room, but in a sprawling penthouse suite at the Mandarin Oriental, overlooking Central Park. Mr. Kobayashi was present, along with a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s, whom he introduced as Akari Tanaka, head of his legal department. There were no false pretenses. Over the next 2 hours, Lena recounted her entire story. Her promising career in Berlin, her work on the Nord's defense project, the sudden data leak, the manipulated reports implicating her, and the swift, brutal manner in which her firm in the industry had cast her aside. She explained her flight to New York, her acceptance of a menial job to remain undetected, her shame and defeat. Mr. Kobayashi and Ms. Tanaka listened intently without interruption, their expressions serious and attentive. When she finished, Ms. Tanaka spoke first. What you describe, Ms. Volk, she said, her English impeccable, is a classic smear and acquire tactic. Discredit the defense from within, create chaos, then swoop in to acquire the assets at a reduced price. Ether Red Holdings served as the legal instrument, but Davenport was the mastermind. To prove it, she continued, we need more than your testimony. We need the original, unaltered data. It's gone, Lena said, the old despair creeping back. It was on a secure server at the bank. After my dismissal, my access was revoked, and my files were archived, meaning they were probably erased. Perhaps, Mr. Kobayashi said, leaning forward. But men like Davenport are arrogant. Arrogance breeds carelessness. They may believe the evidence is destroyed, but digital ghosts are difficult to completely exorcise. This is where we can be of assistance. He explained that his interest wasn't purely altruistic. Davenport Capital's predatory tactics were a cancer in the global market. Kobayashi Heavy Industries believed in building and sustaining, not demolishing and selling for parts. Davenport's attempt to recruit him into Project Chimera was an insult to his business philosophy. Helping Lena was a matter of honor, but also a strategic move to eliminate a dishonorable competitor. We have resources, Ms. Volk, Mr. Kobayashi stated plainly. Technological, legal, and financial. We can fund an investigation. We can hire the best forensic data recovery specialists. But we need your expertise. You know where to look. You know the names, the file structures, the protocols from your time at the bank. Just as this improbable alliance was solidifying, Lena's phone rang. An unknown number with a German country code. Her blood ran cold. She hesitated, then answered, placing the call on speakerphone. Lena? Lena Volk? Lena, is that you? The voice was aged, crackling, and instantly recognizable. It was Professor Ulrich Brandt, her former mentor from her university days in Heidelberg, a man who had taught corporate ethics and been one of the few who believed in her innocence. Professor Brandt, she whispered, stunned. My child, I've been trying to reach you for a year, he said, his voice urgent. I saw an article this morning, a brief mention in an online financial bulletin. A partnership between Davenport Capital and Kobayashi Heavy Industries was abruptly canceled after a dramatic dinner incident in New York. It mentioned Davenport by name. I had a terrible feeling it involved you. Professor, how? It doesn't matter, he interrupted. Listen to me. After you were disgraced, I never believed it. I began my own discreet inquiries. I have a former student, a good man, who now works in IT security at Deutsche Strategic Bank. He always felt your case was mishandled. We spoke last night. Your files weren't wiped, Lena. They were placed in a deep archive, a segregated server used for litigation holds. They couldn't erase them without creating a suspicious data gap. They're dormant, but they exist. Lena stared at the phone, her mind reeling. The evidence she believed lost forever. The digital ghost Mr. Kobayashi had mentioned was real. There's more, Professor Brandt continued, his voice low. The man who replaced you, the one who benefited most from your dismissal, was a senior analyst named Heinrich Bauer. Bauer left the bank 6 months after you did. He now holds a very senior position at the European headquarters of Davenport Capital. The final piece clicked into place. It was an inside job. Bauer had likely been Davenport's mole all along, stealing and altering her data, framing her, and being rewarded for his treachery. Lena looked from her phone to Mr. Kobayashi and Ms. Tanaka. Their expressions were grimly determined. The hunt was no longer just for a ghost. They now had a name, a location, and a target. A transatlantic alliance had been forged, combining Lena's intimate knowledge, Kobayashi's immense resources, and Brandt's crucial intelligence from the heart of the old empire. The war against Dominic Davenport was about to go global. The next 3 weeks were a master class in controlled, relentless pressure. The penthouse suite at the Mandarin Oriental, with its panoramic views of Central Park, transformed from a symbol of luxury into a high-tech transatlantic war room. Whiteboards covered in timelines and names replaced expensive artwork. The quiet hum of servers and encrypted communication lines replaced the gentle classical music. This was Lena's new office, and she had never felt more at home. She found herself at the center of a formidable team. There was Akari Tanaka, Kobayashi's head of legal, a woman whose calm demeanor masked a mind as sharp as a steel trap. She moved with quiet purpose, her calls to legal teams in New York and Frankfurt surgically precise. Then there was Saito, the forensic tech analyst, a young man who seemed to subsist entirely on coffee and instant noodles, his fingers flying across multiple keyboards in a blur. He spoke rarely, but when he did, it was to announce a breakthrough. Lena, for her part, was the heart of the operation. She was the institutional memory, the one who knew the names, the corporate culture of the bank, the protocols, and most importantly, the psychological makeup of the people who had wronged her. The weariness in her eyes was replaced by a sharp analytical fire. Their first target wasn't Dominic Davenport, but the man who had been his instrument, Heinrich Bauer. Men like Bauer are driven by 2 things, greed and ego, Lena explained to the team, pointing to his photo on the whiteboard. He betrayed his firm for money, but he took my job for status. He'll believe his position at Davenport Capital makes him untouchable. That's his weakness. Ms. Tanaka's investigators in Europe began painting a vivid picture of Bauer's life. He wasn't just living well. He was living recklessly. They tracked his lavish spending through public records and discreet sources. A new Porsche, a weekend apartment in Zurich, an online footprint revealing a penchant for high-stakes online poker. He's hemorrhaging money, Ms. Tanaka observed during a late-night briefing, pointing to a financial summary. His salary is substantial, but his expenditures are astronomical. He's supplementing his income. Saito found the source, Saito announced, pulling up a color-coded chart. He's making small, frequent trades in tech and pharmaceutical stocks. They're timed perfectly. always a day or two before major announcements by companies Davenport Capital has an interest in. It's classic insider trading. He's gotten sloppy, arrogant. While the investigators built their case against Bauer, Ms. Tanaka launched the legal assault on Deutsche Strategic Bank. The initial response was a wall of corporate resistance. The bank's lawyers were dismissive, citing privacy laws and statutes of limitations. Ms. Tanaka was unfazed. In a tense video conference with the bank's general counsel in Frankfurt, she laid out her position with chilling clarity. "Herr Schmidt," she began, her voice deceptively pleasant, "we're not on a fishing expedition. We have credible intelligence indicating that a former employee, Lena, was the victim of corporate espionage originating within your institution, leading to significant financial and reputational damage. We also have reason to believe the evidence of this crime is stored on a specific litigation hold server, serial number 7, Alpha Delta. Refusing a legitimate targeted discovery request will force us to file a motion compelling your cooperation. The optics of a major bank actively hiding evidence of a crime to protect a saboteur would be unfortunate, especially when our client, Kobayashi Industries, is considering its future European banking partners. The veiled threat, combining legal force with immense financial pressure, worked. Within 48 hours, a massive, encrypted data file was securely transferred to Saito's servers. The next 72 hours were a tense waiting game. Saito worked around the clock, his corner of the suite littered with empty coffee cups. Lena found she couldn't sleep. She paced the suite, the ghosts of her past swirling around her. What if they found nothing? What if the data had been corrupted beyond recovery? On the third night, just as dawn broke over the city, Saito called her over. His face was pale with exhaustion, but his eyes were bright. "I found it," he whispered, pointing to his central monitor. "It's beautiful." On the screen were 2 documents side by side. The first was titled Nordst VFALX, her file, her work. The second was HB Nordst VF Final Rev, created 97 minutes after hers. "I've run a differential analysis," Saito said, typing a command. The screen lit up with highlighted text. In Bauer's version, revenue projections were lowered by 12%. Operating cost estimates were inflated by 18%. Debt-to-equity ratios were subtly skewed. Individually, the changes were plausible, but together they painted a picture of Lena's strategy as reckless and doomed to fail. It was the work of a skilled liar. "And now for the magic," Saito said. He brought up another window, the server access log. It showed Lena uploading her file at 4:15 p.m. Berlin time. It then showed an access and download of that same file at 4:30 p.m. from an IP address assigned to Henrik Bauer's terminal. Finally, it showed the upload of his revised, sabotaged version at 5:52 p.m. And then the final damning piece of evidence, a log of an encrypted data packet sent from Bauer's terminal at 6:10 p.m. to an offshore server in the Cayman Islands. A server Ms. Tanaka's team had already definitively linked to EtherRed Holdings, Dominic Davenport's shell corporation. Lena stared at the screen, her breath catching in her chest. It was all there. The entire crime laid bare in lines of code and timestamps. It was the truth, pristine and undeniable. She felt a tear slide down her cheek, not of sadness, but of profound, earth-shattering vindication. The final act was swift. Miss Tanaka and a German lawyer flew to Geneva. They didn't storm Bauer's office. They invited him for coffee at a discreet 5-star hotel. He arrived looking smug and slightly annoyed. He barely had time to order an espresso before Ms. Tanaka slid a tablet across the table. On it was the evidence of his insider trading. We believe this constitutes a significant breach of your employment contract with Davenport Capital, not to mention a violation of several Swiss and EU financial regulations, she said calmly. Bauer sputtered denials. Ms. Tanaka let him finish, then slid a second tablet across the table. This one displayed the server logs from the bank. His smugness evaporated, replaced by raw animal panic. My client, Lena Voke, has no interest in seeing you in prison, Herr Bauer, Ms. Tanaka said, her voice like ice. She wants the man who gave the orders. You have one chance to give us a full, signed confession detailing Dominic Davenport's role in the entire affair. In return, we will provide this evidence of your unrelated financial activities to the authorities, who will likely be far more lenient on a cooperative witness than on a common criminal. Cornered and exposed, Heinrich Bauer broke completely. He confessed to everything. With Bauer's signed confession, the dossier was complete. They didn't go to the authorities first. That path was slow and prone to backroom deals. Mr. Kobayashi wanted a public execution. He personally contacted the editors of 3 of the world's most respected financial newspapers, the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, and the Handelsblatt. The entire package was delivered simultaneously, with an embargo of 6 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. The next day, Lena was awake, watching the sunrise from the penthouse window when the first alerts hit her phone. The headlines were brutal. Davenport's deceit. Leaked files reveal years of corporate espionage. Nordst Davenport Capital framed analysts to seize German gem. The fall of a titan. The fallout was immediate and catastrophic. Trading on stocks linked to Davenport Capital was halted. The SEC, BaFin, and the Swiss authorities announced coordinated, wide-ranging investigations. Davenport's investors, the powerful men and women he had made rich, turned on him with the ferocity of a shark pack. The emergency board meeting wasn't a negotiation. It was an amputation. They severed every tie, clawed back every bonus they legally could, and threw him out to face the consequences alone. He was a pariah. Lena watched an interview with a visibly shaken board member on TV. We had no idea, the man lied. Dominic Davenport acted alone. His actions are a betrayal of everything we stand for. A week later, a formal settlement offer arrived from Deutsche Strategic Bank. A 9-figure sum, a number so large it seemed unreal. It was hush money, an apology, and restitution all rolled into one. Looking at it, Lena felt a strange detachment. The money was validation, but it couldn't buy back the lost years, the shame, the struggle. Her future was an open, intimidating expanse. She had her name back, her reputation not just restored, but enhanced. Job offers flooded in from investment banks and private equity firms, all eager to hire the woman who had outplayed Dominic Davenport. But the idea of returning to that life, of poring over spreadsheets to make the rich richer, felt like a betrayal of her own journey. She met Mr. Kobayashi one last time in the now dismantled war room. You have a choice, Ms. Voke, he said. You can return to the game, a more powerful player than before, or you can help change the rules. He laid out his vision. The Prometheus Institute, a non-profit foundation dedicated to corporate ethics and accountability. It would be funded by a coalition of companies led by Kobayashi Industries, companies that believed long-term value came from integrity, not predation. It would investigate corporate malfeasance, provide legal aid to whistleblowers, and advocate for stronger regulations. I need someone to lead its European operations, Mr. Kobayashi said. Someone with the skills of an analyst, the heart of a survivor, and the courage of a fighter. Someone who understands exactly what we are up against. Lena looked out the window at the vast city below. She had come here to disappear. She had been a ghost, a whisper. Now she was being offered a sword. She would not be analyzing companies to acquire them. She would be analyzing them to hold them accountable. She would be the guardian she never had. A slow smile spread across her face, the first genuine, joyful smile in years. Mr. Kobayashi, she said, her voice clear and strong. When do I start? That's the incredible story of Lena Volk. A woman who reminds us that strength and intelligence are not defined by a job title or a uniform. It's a powerful testament to the fact that you never truly know the battles the person standing next to you has fought or the hidden power they hold within. Lena's story is about more than just revenge. It's about resilience, the reclamation of one's identity, and the surprising alliances that can form in the fight for justice. It shows that even in a world seemingly dominated by the loud and the arrogant, a quiet, steady voice speaking the truth can bring down an empire. If you were inspired by Lena's courage and her fight for what is right, please show your support by hitting that like button. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder of their own inner strength. And for more true life stories of incredible twists of fate and triumphant underdogs, make sure to subscribe to our channel and ring that notification bell. Thank you for listening.